Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God and our Mother, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. What's up, guys? Welcome back to Fireside with Fathers. We have a very good one on tonight, which I'm excited about. We've been bold enough to put 3 topics in the title, and I don't know if we're going to be able to get through them. I'm hoping we are. So we're with Father Jeff Langan again. And it's a bit of a newer style tonight, so we're going to see how this works. It's basically we're going to be putting up like 3 kind of like news headlines, and we're going to interpret and read them. So before we get into that, I want you guys to be clear that we're not just telling news stories or commenting on the news, which I think, you can get that anywhere. Here, this is something that, like in Father Jeff's own words, this is going to be expert commentary based on years of research, study, and prayer from a Catholic point of view, interpreting what's going on right now in the light of the Gospels. It's going to also be suggesting paths for you guys if you want to get deeper into, where these leads are. We're going to leave descriptions in the link below because it's also helpful, like where you're getting your sources. And sometimes people get lost. There's so much going on. They don't know. They get kind of dizzy just looking around, like where are they going to get their sources? And how to resist getting caught up in all these events that are happening. So that this diminishes basically the growth of the kingdom within our hearts. I've seen that so many times. These WhatsApp groups where you're just getting loads and loads of feeds and you can get drawn up and taken out of where you're supposed to be. So that's also dangerous. There's going to be hopefully a key to how do I live all this without getting lost? And then another thing that you're big into, Father Jeff, is to hopefully foment the lay people to take a part in this, to get a role, to form themselves, the world, the situation we're living in, and go out there and absolutely, do something. So as a priest, you've got the tools, you have the research and also the past where you can point people on to hopefully develop this more. So the first thing we have up tonight is we're going to talk about the narrative, the media narrative. We have up here series Black Mirror. I don't know, Jeff, if you want to just briefly explain that, what Black Mirror is or why we want to start with this. But this is basically our first one here, talking about the media narrative.
Sure. Well, one thing we've discussed in the past, and this is a whole area of study which is extremely important, that doesn't really ever get addressed in junior high or high school or in literature courses, but it's this intersection which the people who are in charge of the government, the people who are trying to rule the world, the oligarchs, for example, who are trying to rule the world by also controlling governments. I mean, they work very closely with the media because they understand the importance of narrative. Number one, they understand the importance of narrative, that everybody needs a way to explain things. I think number two, what we see in things like Black Mirror, and we can point to other examples of this, but we see, I think, what's called now predictive programming, that there are individuals who are advisors in these series who, there's another video I think I sent you that we could discuss at some point with this Dutch scholar, but he puts a triangle up. He puts a triangle up in which he says, well, there's this connection between, on the one hand, the media, on the other hand, intelligence services of states. And I think the intelligence services of states could also be broadly understood as corporations which now cooperate or coordinate with the intelligence services of states. And then with internet technology. And so something like Black Mirror, there are more players involved in it than simply just a group of people who happen to have some money and they just like telling stories. Right? So for example, Robert Kennedy, in his book on Anthony Fauci, in the final chapters of his book, he lays out how, number one, the intelligence services are involved in making movies, making television shows as advisors. And oftentimes what they advise on is they advise on scenarios. Scenarios like, what would happen if a coronavirus broke out in some sort of an unrestrained way? Or what would happen? And actually, Robert Kennedy in his book on Fauci, he actually shows not not what he shows is not these series, but what he shows is the advisors who planned simulations that had to do with government, pandemics, and whatnot, right? That many of the advisors who advised the government on how to act during, let's say, the last 2 or 3 years, they were also advisors in making, if not Black Mirror series, a series like Black Mirrors or films like Contagion. So that one of the things we see happening in our own day is there is this, and it happened back in the 40s and 50s and 60s, but we didn't think of it. But it happens now where there is this collaboration going on between the intelligence services of government, the media companies like Netflix, and internet technology. And so you can look at a series like Black Mirror, and you can look at even individual episodes, and you can see in them efforts to, well, try to explain reality in some way, but also predicting, also in a way, they're playing through scenarios. They're playing through scenarios that at some point people might try to act on or people might try to act out. I think there's a final element that's interesting in something like Black Mirror. And that final element is it's a reality of human psychology. It's a reality that Dr. E. Michael Jones points out in his book, Monsters from the Id. And the reality is, especially when you're dealing with horror, that in a way you could say, no matter who's conspiring to try to tell what story and control what narrative, that human psychology is still human psychology. And human morality is still human morality. And eventually, especially in horror films, especially in fantasy, sci-fi, horror, eventually morality is going to show itself. Morality is going to come out, right? You can't stomp out morality. And so Dr. Jones, I think very effectively shows that you go back even to the origins of horror, like the Frankenstein novels of Mary Shelley, that she herself in many ways rejected morality. But in the end, what she tells in Frankenstein is a moral tale, right? Is something that you can't get away from. And I think in this particular episode that we saw, or the link that we shared in Black Mirror, I think on the one hand, the analysis of the episode, the person who is writing about why Black Mirror might be scary, he's basically showing how this convergence is happening between corporate media interests, the government, intelligence services, and they're trying to basically create. He thinks this particular episode is a horror episode because the guy who's in charge of the starship, the Star Trek like ship, right? He's preserving people's DNA. He's basically doing a number of things that are AI like, right? And that's obviously in our cultural battles, that's the next step. That's the next step the oligarchs are trying to take. They're going to go eventually from transgender to transhumanism. And they're going to try to control people's lives. They're going to try to enter into our brains. People are talking about, for example, developing a vaccine that will make people stop thinking about God, right? The oligarchs are contemplating this reality. Well, in this particular Black Mirror episode, by the end of the episode, the crew revolts against the Captain Kirk character, who's really a terrible person. I mean, he's really a terrible person. He's not interested. He's ultimately not like Captain Kirk at all. He's not interested in service. He's not interested in doing good or making things more human in whatever way. He's ultimately interested in control and power. And I thought it was really interesting that while we were contemplating discussing this particular episode and the video that came out, we had another this past week, another item of Jeff Zucker having to step down from CNN. And this is one of those instances where I think Dr. Jones's book can help us explain this Black Mirror episode. Also, this Black Mirror episode can also help us understand contemporary events, perhaps even beyond the way that the creators of this Black Mirror episode envisioned. Because, well, why? Well, because essentially CNN is kind of like the Starship Enterprise on this Black Mirror episode. And what we're seeing is that the leaders of CNN, they got to a point where they were no longer interested in news. It seemed that their company had just become a spaceship of some sorts, where they were, more than anything, they were collaborating with intelligence services and government so as to be the imperial media, so as to wield power, so as to try to control minds, so as to enter into people's minds and hearts and control their narratives, right? And the problem is human nature. The problem is eventually, even people who for some time go along with all this, eventually they're going to rebel against it, right? They can't go along with it. You can only go along with lies for so long, right? And I think we see this happening with the way CNN collaborated with the Cuomo family, covering up all these different injustices, but also fundamentally from a business standpoint, covering up their own possibility of making money, right? And so eventually, just as in the episode, this fellow's efforts of exercising power and control, they crumble because imperfect people can't go along with it. Well, the same thing is happening. We see the same thing happening in CNN right now, right? And this, I think if there's an image that's really controlling, it's the image of Plato's cave, the allegory of the cave, right? This is one of the oldest allegories, and it points us to something that is absolutely true. And what it points us to that's absolutely true is that, well, in the allegory of the cave, if you remember the image, right, there are puppet masters, and they have a fire of some sort, and then between the puppet masters and the fire, they create images that get shown on the wall, right? And everybody's transfixed by the images on the wall. And the image, of course, the image on the wall is not real, but the image on the wall that's created by the puppet masters with the idea of controlling the people. And what Plato points out through the allegory on the cave is that, well, there are going to be people that eventually detach themselves from the wall. They're going to go up out of the darkness of the cave, and they're going to eventually get to the light of the sun. They're going to see things as they are. Now, I think a modern version of the allegory of the cave, you can see it in works like the works of Thorstein Veblen, right? Where you get, Thorstein Veblen says, well, clearly at this point in the world, we don't just have nations and corporations and people. Clearly at this point in the world, we have a leisure class. Who are the leisure class? Leisure class are those people that don't feel aligned to any nation. And in fact, they have so much wealth, they can exercise power on their own. And one of the ways that they know they exercise power is through public relations. It's through being the puppet masters. And there are other works in the 20th century. Carroll Quigley, he pointed this out. We together, I think, looked at this video last week with this Geopolitics and Empire, this Dutch scholar, Van Cleese, right? They all have done great work in actually saying, well, who are these ruling families who are these 3,000 people that they don't operate in any government, but they operate through things like the Bilderberg Society. They operate through the World Economic Forum. They operate through the Club of Rome. And through these institutions, they can control and coordinate governments, Hollywood, public relations, of the media, in all sorts of, and they also coordinate with intelligence services. And so one of the big questions I think of our time that I think this Black Mirror episode kind of gestures towards it is, well, is there a legitimate authority? And also, who ultimately decides, right? Who ultimately decides what policies will be carried out, and for what purpose will they be carried out? And I think the last 2 or 3 years have made it clear, and we see this happening in politics in many countries, right? And maybe this could lead us to our next topic, that who ultimately is making the decisions, for example, about war and peace, about the lives of nations, about whether a nation is adhering or not, or trying to adhere to the common good or not, or justice, right? One of the promises of the Enlightenment was that people would be ruled by self-government, right? The people would have a say in who ruled over them, their politicians, and that the politicians, in serving the common good, they would also be accountable to the people. And one of the threats, going back to the ancient world, but one of the threats to self-government are the puppet masters, our oligarchs, right? Our individuals who have accumulated wealth, and by their wealth, they have accumulated power, and they want to order society in their own interest and not in the interest of the common good, either of the nation and now of the world. And one of the great things that we see happening in our own age is that these oligarchs are now global. They're not attached to any one nation. They benefit. They grow in wealth. I mean, the people who have benefited the most these last 2 or 3 years are the elite global. And the dramatic question of our time is whether it's the life of a nation or in the international order, is will the political order, will it be ordered towards the common good, or will it be ordered according to the interest of the oligarchs, which is not necessarily in the interest of justice or of the common good? Will it be ordered towards the will of a man, like this fictional character on the Starship Enterprise? And I think that brings us actually to the Ukraine. I don't know if you want
to. No, it's perfect. It's perfect.
Ask a question, or
no, you're just
put up an article of some
Yeah,
sort.
we're gonna get into the next one. Just you definitely whetted the appetite there with the narrative, and I think what people are catching on. But like the beauty of this is that you really do pinpoint it, and like I said, if people are kind of left hanging with more interest, we're gonna leave more links in the description where you can keep following up. But it is a very interesting critique on the Black Mirror. It's the last things I think the YouTuber's called, but it is very good. So this here came out. It was Bloomberg. So apparently Russia invaded Ukraine. Their latest news. Maybe that can spark up the next one.
So this is an interesting little headline. I think it's worth just looking at this. So what the New York Post here is reporting a mistake that Bloomberg made last week. And the mistake that Bloomberg made last week is that, I think it was Friday, Bloomberg published an article. They published an article with the headline, as you see here, Russia invades Ukraine. And of course, it immediately got caught by people on Twitter. What do you mean Russia invades Ukraine? There's no Russian invasion of Ukraine. There's no evidence of this. It can't be verified. And then after a few hours, after this happened, a few hours after this happened, Bloomberg at some point apologized for their misinformation, their fake news that they said it was a pre-programmed headline. Now, this is even more significant because what essentially they're saying is that we're ready for the invasion of Ukraine. I mean, we're gonna publish it one way or another. We're trying to make it happen. We want to make it happen. We're gonna do everything in our power to make it happen. So we have a dynamic here, and I think this is a moment where it's good to take a step back. Now, I had the good fortune when I was in college. I had a professor who, before he became a professor of diplomatic history, he worked for the State Department. And he told us precisely one of his jobs back in the late 60s, early 70s was to condition the headlines. Like, he was the guy who was there to help condition the headlines, oftentimes 2 or 3 years in advance. Wow. Of what would be known as world historical type events. And I don't think I really paid much attention to his lectures until 15 or 20 years after I was in college and I was a professor at the time. But certainly if we start applying like the little nugget of information that he gave me, if we apply this to Ukraine, I think we can see that essentially what's happening in the Ukraine is that after the Cold War, we've discussed this before, right, on this course, or on this show. But after the Cold War, the U.S. had to figure out some sort of foreign policy model to follow. And I think essentially in our own time, like when we think about Russia and the Ukraine and China, I think it's important actually that we forget a little bit about the ideological wars from like 1950 to 1989, 1990 of, communism versus capitalism versus the West. I think actually it's more helpful just to kind of think about pre-World War I, right? It's pre-World War I where Mackinder helped the British develop the heartland theory, the Mackinder thesis, which is basically this idea that there are sea powers and there are land powers. And the sea powers are essentially England, the United States, South Africa, Australia. They considered Japan also, right, one of the sea powers. And the goal of the sea powers is to keep the land powers disunited. And this became, for example, Britain before the First World War, they wanted a war which they could humiliate Germany because Germany represented an economic threat to England. Germany represented the possibility of uniting economically with Russia. And the basic idea was between German ingenuity and Russian natural resources, the Germans and the Russians could establish an economy that didn't need the sea powers, that didn't need the Anglo-American Empire. And this model, I think, has controlled foreign policy in the United States since. And during the Cold War, we had this thing of we're opposing communism. Communism is bad. Materialist atheism is bad. Okay. But after the Cold War, essentially what's happening? After the Cold War, what's essentially happening is that we're trying to strangle Russia and China. Right? What's going on in the Ukraine? Well, what are the two things that are really going on in the Ukraine is that going back to 2004, 2005, we've been doing everything in our power to take over the government of the Ukraine so that the leadership of the Ukraine is basically a proxy of the United States. Why? Because our ultimate goal is to try to strangle Russia. Not because Russia's communist, because Russia isn't communist anymore. That's just our goal. And so like right now, what are we trying to do? We're trying to, on the one hand, prevent Russia from selling natural gas to Germany. Why? Because if there's this union of the Russian-German economy, then they could operate independently of the Anglo-American Empire, of the economy of the sea powers. Also, we are trying ultimately to kind of break up Russia. And one of the things that we know at this point is that Russia has a defensive missile system which can prevent us from bombing her. you know, and also, Russia also has a missile system which could probably take out every airport in Europe in 2 weeks. Now, one of the things that we want to do is our military has been developing hypersonic missiles. These are not defensive missiles, but these are hypersonic missiles which we think could outflank the Russian defensive missiles. And we want to put those missiles, if we can, in the Ukraine. And if we can't in the Ukraine, we want to put them in Poland, Romania, the Baltic states. And so the whole conflict right now in the Ukraine, what is it about? It's basically about Russia negotiating with us behind the scenes, essentially saying, we don't want these hypersonic missiles on our border because this would represent a mortal threat to Russia. And essentially, the other thing that we're doing, though, by our foreign policies, we're creating this alliance, this friendship between Russia and China and Iran. Because Russia and China and Iran, they all understand that our foreign policy at this point is a kind of aggressive, certainly not in accord with Catholic just war theory, but it's an aggressive foreign policy that's meant to, one by one, cripple and make Russia, China, Iran subservient to the Anglo-American economic and military machine. And I think this brings us back to the question we were asking before, which is there's an emerging international order. We see, for example, Robert Kennedy points this out in his book on Anthony Fauci. We see from the year 2000 until to the present, these international simulations that were carried out, and they were coordinated between all leaders and the oligarchic clubs of the world, right? We see the oligarchic clubs of the world. It seems like they're trying to create a world order in which the nations of the world will be subservient to the oligarchs. I think that oligarchs now have influence in China, in Russia, in the Ukraine, right? I think we could also identify certain families that have wealthy people in the United States, in Russia, in the Ukraine, in Germany, in China, right? Who are all really more subservient to the oligarchs than they are to the good of their nation. And I think the dramatic question of the world right now is, in this new emerging international order that's going to develop, is it going to be in the interest of these 3,000 oligarchs? Or is it going to be one nation or one group of nations that dominates the international order? And so, for example, the neoconservatives, who have advisors who are very influential both in any Democratic or any Republican administration in the United States, and they have influence in the formation of NATO for those in Europe, right? They want the United States, they want what I would call the Anglo-American Empire. They want it to be the controlling force in the international order. Do they want it to be according to justice? That doesn't matter. They just want to control it, right? And so there are others. I think the Vatican, for example, I think the Vatican ultimately thinks that, well, just as in 19th century Europe, you had Austria, you had France, you had England, and they kind of operated in such a way so as to create more or less of a stable system. I think the Vatican, in their diplomacy, they're hoping to try to be kind of a fair player. I think they're hoping that legitimate political institutions develop from the UN or between continents or whatnot that are governed by a desire for the common good and for justice, right? So the dramatic question, we might say, as far as the Ukraine and as far as the overall international order, is in something like the Ukraine, will it be justice and the interest of the common good that resolves the situation? Or will the oligarchs try to use their puppet master technology in order to lure these nations into a hot war, right? Which I think some of the oligarchs want, because again, you can make a lot of money from war.
Yeah, but Father
Or
Jeff, just you mentioned like these missiles and everything, like a hot war. Would that even be possible? Like, wouldn't we just obliterate like everything? Or
a hot war is definitely possible, right? Why else would Bloomberg have that headline ready to go, right? I mean, they have the headline ready to go because there are some people in the different oligarchs. Now, by the way, I speak about the oligarchs. The oligarchs are not always united in what they want to do. It's not like they're always like this monolithic group. They also have their little competitions between each other, and they have their different ideas. But I think you can see that I listed an article that, one of the, if you go back even to the Black Mirror episode, how does the guy govern? How does that guy govern on the ship? He governs out of fear. He makes everybody afraid of him. One mechanism of government is creating, and even Hitchcock speaks about this. It's a great way to keep people interested in a movie, is to have some unknown fear that is running throughout the plot. I mean, it's one thing to have a bad guy and the bad guy and you can fight against the bad guy. But an even greater fear, which is actually even better for controlling people, is an unknown fear. A fear that you don't really have the cause of it. You don't know where it is. You don't know what it is, right? The unknown fear. So if you think about this, like just in terms of political history, right? Going back to the Cold War, in a way, like the Russian fear, it was a known fear. Communism, communist Soviet Union, communist this, communist that, right? It's kind of a known fear. Once the Cold War winds down, our deep state, our elites, whatever you want to call them, the oligarchs, they're looking for a new fear. They need a new fear to control people. And for a while, the effort was Islamic terror. I mean, Islamic terror is an unknown fear. And then you can see in 2008, 2009, there was an effort to once again start to make Russia, right? Evil Russia. But the problem with 2008, 2009 making Russia evil is that, well, Russia's not communist anymore. And actually, that's part of the problem right now of trying to make China evil, is that China's not communist anymore either. I mean, they have the Communist Party and whatnot, but it's not Marxist communism. It's not. They're not seeking to spread communism all over the world, like in the way that Leon Trotsky did or anything like that. So, and of course, in the last 2 or 3 years, we had a wonderful unknown fear to get also in an amazing way, right? Which was worked on all these simulations from the year 2000 until 2019, right? Where they worked out how you could use this wonderful unknown fear to control peoples and nations and behavior and everything and bring about a great reset of the world, right? That was just a great, but it's interesting, right? Why, like Ukraine is heating up now. Fear of Russia. ISIS emerged last week in the news again, right? Why? Because, well, this great fear, the Financial Times had an article in January 2021 that the whole fear of the virus was winding down. People weren't buying it anymore. And already in 2021, the Financial Times was saying, we got to find something else. This can only go on for so long. So I think that's one of the reasons why you see Ukraine getting wound up again, right? That the oligarchs, the elites, they understand that, well, this 2-year run is coming to an end and we got to find something else. And again, just in the case of World War One, right? There was the buildup before World War One, the antagonisms between nations, and eventually there was a trigger that led to the war. And you could definitely see that, well, if fear is a mechanism for control, and once war, especially in the United States, right? Once war happens, everybody fears the enemy, and that fear of the enemy leads everybody just to become super compliant, right? America, in a way, is one of the worst places in the world as far as once war starts, nobody asks any questions, right? It's like a great way to control the population. So it wouldn't surprise me if the oligarchs get to a point where they basically say, there's nothing else we can do but let these nations go to war.
Wow.
War is also a great way. I mean, again, the oligarchs have made explicit they want to reset the world. They want to reset the financial system. And war is a great way to reset everything, just from a kind of Machiavellian standpoint.
So you're saying a virus wouldn't be enough, really, just to that wouldn't be enough to get everybody to, I don't know, to do the reset. Like you need something else here.
Oh, you mean like the pandemic wasn't
Yeah.
enough? Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing that, one avenue they've been exploring for 20 years is climate. Right? So I mean, what are the things that potentially cause fear? A virus, climate, obviously war, some bad guy, Islamic terror, right? These are things that narrative creators can appeal to for for instilling fear in people, and therefore in turn controlling their actions.
But do you think like now more than ever, like if you even went back pre-World War One, and you're comparing it, would you say like a difference now is that there are big pockets, and I think thanks to like the means that we have to get it out there, that are actually having an influence and waking up, like Joe Rogan, for example. Like I was talking to someone today that they said that guy is, I don't know how many views or followers CNN would have, but I think Joe Rogan blows him out of the water as far as like the most listened to guy on Spotify, and he really just like
40 million a week.
It's unbelievable.
He gets 40 million viewers a week. That's like 4 times the next highest news show.
It's unreal. Isn't the guy from Fear Factor? I think I remember him from like when he was just on that like dinky show. But anyways, he's speaking his mind now. And so what's the deal here with Rogan and him getting semi-censored?
So there's an image we put up earlier in the show of this triangle between IT, intelligence, and media. And I look at there's 2 ways I think we can look at the whole Joe Rogan phenomenon at this point. So on the one hand, because of the internet, right? So obviously you go back to the ancient world and you can see that there's this collaboration that goes on between the imperial media and the intelligence services of governments. Ever since the 1990s, and Hilaire Belloc's book, The Free Press, I think foresees this in a way, right? But ever since the 1990s, you have YouTube. You and I we're having this conversation right now in Ireland and Cambridge, Massachusetts. And so in the last 20 years or so, you get an entire community, you get an entire group of people within nations and across nations that are communicating with each other, and they're not controlled by they're not controlled by the puppet masters. They're not controlled by the intelligence services or the imperial media. And there's a large group of people that actually go to YouTube and Rockfin or Rumble or whatever, and they have common sense and logic, and they use it to discover the truth. I know a fellow here in Cambridge who was baptized 2 years ago, and he was at Reed College. He was obviously he grew up unbaptized. He met a girl at Reed College at the end of some sort of waster party They were the only two people left standing, right? And they were left standing because they were just like, again, they weren't baptized or anything, but they were just like, well, this is crazy. I can't do this. And then they met each other. They kind of became boyfriend and girlfriend. And what did they do? I mean, they were at Reed College is like it's where Steve Jobs went, or yeah, Steve Jobs went to Reed College. It's kind of very, I think we would characterize it now as like a woke, super leftist, woke liberal arts school. Well, this guy and this girl, they basically go in their dorm room and they start watching videos on YouTube, but not like the typical, not the things that YouTube promotes, drag queens and things like that. But they actually like start watching people making arguments about the world and how it works and blah, 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 blah. And it got to a point, and then again, it took them in all sorts of directions, but it got to a point where they basically said, we either have to become white nationalists or Catholics. And they obviously they became Catholics because and then somehow they heard a rumor, go to Cambridge, and there's a church in Cambridge where you can convert to Catholicism. So they graduated from Reed College. They both came to Cambridge, and they found the local church here, and they converted to Catholicism. And what's funny is that, I mean, there's a lot of stories like theirs of people who, through internet technology, they came to the truth. And I think this is one of the big concerns of that the imperial media has, and that the intelligence services have, with people like Joe Rogan. Because what he represents is that there's a lot of truth seekers out there who have become somewhat sophisticated in their understanding of propaganda and where it comes from, how the oligarchs use it. And they're just not, they don't have all the answers. I'm not saying that everything is right or correct, or that I would, but they become, because they ask questions, because they're not satisfied with fake news, because they just don't easily buy into the propaganda. And again, this guy has 40 million people listening to him every week. I think the next highest in the United States, as far as some sort of news personality that people watch, is Tucker Carlson. And I think the statistics I saw is he has 12 million people watching him. Right? And so this guy's got 40 million a week watching him. That's incredible. So one way of looking at it would be to say that, this is something that has to be contained. This is something we can't let to go on. So what do the intelligence services do? They get all of their, it's so funny, like these people like Neil Young and these singers that are so old that nobody even knows who they are anymore. Well, it seems to me that these singers are revealing themselves as CIA stooges. I mean, that they're revealing themselves as stooges of the intelligence services, who are just more than happy to do whatever they're paid to do. Attacking Joe Rogan or demanding somehow that Joe Rogan leave Spotify, or they want all their stuff taken down, yada, yada, yada. I mean, they're just complete political stooges. And so on the one hand, people are aware of this. In fact, it's probably likely in the end that Spotify will kick Joe Rogan off, or they'll give him money to go away.
Yeah, I think they've taken down many of his episodes already that have been taken down.
Probably what'll happen is he'll go to Rumble. He'll go to Rumble, or he'll go to one of these free speech platforms, and he'll take everybody with him, because that's how he went to Spotify in the first place. Is Spotify discovered we can put him on Spotify and his whole audience will follow him to us. I mean, so this is a terrible situation. If you're an oligarch, Joe Rogan is a terrible situation, because in a way, no matter what he does now, the media that you control is going to lose even more credibility. It's the people. We're going back to the Black Mirror episode again. It's the people on the Starship Enterprise. I mean, they're taking out the boss, right? So I think one way of looking at it, now there could be like an even deeper, let's say, conspiratorial way of looking at it, which is like Joe Rogan is like the World Wrestling Federation for all of us plebes. And on some level, right, Joe Rogan is not, I mean, he's not an oligarch. And so another way of looking at it would be it's like the World Wrestling Federation of the 1980s, right? That he's just like one wrestler, and he's there with Spotify, and Spotify's the other wrestlers, and it's just kind of a sideshow for us to distract us from the ways in which the oligarchs are taking over government. By the way, that picture from the 80s, if a picture is worth 1,000 words,
We'll put it back up.
it tells you a lot. As far, I mean, the Twin Towers, they were you have to go through the Twin Towers, right? So this was World Wrestling Federation. This was tag team wrestling. And of course, Hulk Hogan and Randy Macho Man, they were the good guys, the mega powers. And then the Twin Towers come down in 9/11. And who brings down the Twin Towers? Of course, this is just a terrible stereotype of an Islamic guy, a Middle Easterner. That's the first era of terror after 9/11. And then who's the other guy is a police officer. He represents the deplorables. I mean, he represents like average American guy. And of course, that's who right now what we have happening in our political system is we're reverting to some of these classical variables that are described by people like Polybius, by Thucydides, by Aristotle. Our politics are now really defined as the oligarchs against the people. I mean, the trucker movement in Canada, you can see this more and more in politics in the United States. There's an article that I cited for you, Why They Hate Us. What you see happening more and more is that it's not ideological conflicts between parties. What you see happening more and more is that the people who are governed by a certain understanding of common sense, I'm not saying they're like super philosophers, but the oligarchs are really at war against the people. So yeah, this little graph comes from Wilson Carey McWilliams through Patrick Deneen. Patrick Deneen is a professor right now at Notre Dame, the University of Notre Dame. And what this graph shows is that the two vectors on the graph are basically social. The bottom part would be like economic libertarianism. The top would be some sort of regulation of the economy in the interest of the common good. And then the left would be social and cultural things, some sort of, again, regulation in the interest of the common good and morality. The right would be kind of some sort of radical libertarianism, like no social controls in matters of morality. In the 1970s and the 1980s, in this chart, things were much more spread out. And one of the real things that's really interesting that's happened in the last 20 years is the upper left-hand quadrant, which means people think there should be some sort of regulation of morality, some sort of, interest of the common good as far as the social order, and some sort of economic regulation in the interest of the common good. More and more people are, you can see if you look at it over time, more and more people are going in that direction, which actually is the direction that's probably the most at home for anybody that adheres to Catholic social teaching. Why? Because we believe that there's a common good, and we believe that in the interest of the common good, there's a legitimate role of authority to regulate the passions, whether it's the economic passions or the military passions or the sensual passions, right? There's all sorts of passions that we potentially have, but it's always ultimately it's the authority of Christ, right? That leads us to learn how to sacrifice our passions, sacrifice our interests in the interest of the good of souls. And that's the beginning of acting towards the common good. And this chart shows, and the purpose of the article was to say, this is why the oligarchs hate us. Why? Because the oligarchs, they do divide up into different factions, but essentially the oligarchs, there's always some passion that some oligarch essentially says, I should not be limited in this passion. The first one being the desire to make money, right? There's always some passion or some group of passions that the oligarchs, they want to give into in an unrestrained way, right? And that's why they hate us. Because even if we may have our disagreements about, what to regulate, what not to regulate, this or that, right? But overall, that's why the oligarchs don't like the people. And that's why the church ultimately is the defender of the people. Because the church is the one who articulates the law that if you follow it, it will protect you against those who want you to give into vice so they can exploit you.
That's beautiful. I think before we got on air or whatever live, by the way, we might be going over to Rumble at some point as well, myself and you, Father. So just
get ready to rumble.
Joey. But we were talking about Augustine's City of God, how he says that we're always sacrificing to someone, whether it be to God or to the demons, and just our daily acts.
Yeah, I would say that Augustine in the City of God, he makes this point that is true. This may be difficult for our ears to accept this point, but he makes a point that's true, which is that every human action is a religious action. Every human action is a potential sacrifice. It's a potential sacrifice of something to some being. And in a way, as Augustine is evaluating the Roman Empire, and as he's evaluating human action, he essentially comes to the conclusion that in actions which are vicious or not in the interest of the common good, what's going on? It's the oligarchs or it's tyrants. And what they're doing is that they're asking you to sacrifice your blood for their good. Your blood, your treasure, right? Right? That's when you have an unjust system or a tyranny. They're asking you to make sacrifices. They're asking you to accept all risk. And Augustine, I think he says, well, ultimately, right? Well, who is this sacrifice ultimately being offered to? It can't be offered to God. God wouldn't accept it. So it must be offered to demons. Right? So essentially, if every action is religious and every action is a sacrifice, essentially what is satanic, what is demonic? It's those who are seeking to control you, to draw your blood, to draw your good, in order to make of you a sacrifice to demons. Wow. Whereas, what does God want? Only God can ask sacrifice, and only we can freely, you might say, agree, just as Christ agreed to sacrifice himself on the cross as a propitiatory sacrifice so that we could be recreated as God's children and a number of other things, right? But essentially, that's the city of God. The city of God are those who unite themselves to Christ's sacrifice. And then they unite their daily actions, whether it's as a person or as a family or as a city or as a nation, they unite their daily actions as sacrifices through the Mass that are united to the cross, that build up the body of Christ. Right? So on the one hand, that's what gives us some hope. It also gives us something to do in each one of our lives. Right? We can start to transform every minute of the day, every difficulty of our life, every problem that we have into a sacrifice, everything that bothers or annoys us, and even things that we enjoy, right? We can turn all of those into sacrifices that we unite to the holy sacrifice of the Mass, that we offer to God the Father for the redemption of souls, for the oligarchs, I mean, for everybody, right? And our whole day, every day, our whole life can become a kind of sacrifice that's offered to the Blessed Trinity through the holy sacrifice of the Mass. And then we can then, especially lay people, right? We can set out That's the whole thing of the kingship of Christ. We can set out to make all professions, social life, conducive to people learning this and doing it as families, as cities, as nations.
That's beautiful. And I think hopefully that's the idea behind all of this. And as you led that, I think, beautifully into that that dynamic and that reality that we're living. And hopefully people listening will get a bit more, I think, interested in that. So instead of just closing in and like seeing the doom, hopefully.
If I could say something, I think that the temptation is to become angry, right? The temptation is always to become angry. And once we become angry, what do? We start to participate in demonic sacrifice, right? We get sucked into it, right? So in other words, when we learn, though, the truth, and when we start to see how we could be controlled and manipulated by the puppets, by the shadows on the wall, well, then that helps us to not so much become angry, but instead to see that I gotta somehow transform this difficulty. And only God can do this. Only God can take what is evil and transform it into good. And he does that through the cross. Right? So the more we learn about propaganda, psychological warfare, everything we were discussing today, well, that helps us to free us from the chains that keep us focused on the wall. So that then we can see the truth for what it is and our role in propagating the truth.
I love it. So that's actually spot on. I think with that, maybe we can just get a question here. I don't know if it's going from the Sublime to Macho Man and Hulk Hogan, but anyways, there was a question there. Which one represents the oligarchs in the wrestling photo that we had?
Yeah, so I mean, being a huge fan of Randy Macho Man Savage and Hulk Hogan, I hate to say it though, but they represent the oligarchs in that photo. They represent the neoconservative oligarchs in that photo. Yes.
And you're talking that Saturday night main event. You're talking like the late '80s, early '90s, aren't you?
Yeah. I mean, this would be kind of like an ultimate form of predictive programming.
That's crazy. Yeah, no, that's absolutely nuts. Well, anyways, Father, so if you want, maybe we could end.
But actually, but even saying that they represent the oligarchs, I mean, it also shows you a little bit the cleverness, right? That so often those who maybe are not representing the good, well, they can present themselves as heroes.
Yeah. My dad actually said he beat up Hulk Hogan, and I believed him till I was 18 years old. But I found out in college that it wasn't true. But anyways, if you want, you can maybe end with a prayer and a blessing, and please God, we'll have you back on. And I liked this. It was a good style, and it flowed. And I think it's very informative. And you really,
good.
It is. It's the light that we can bring into these situations. I think you nailed it there at the end. So hopefully, please God, we'll focus in on our daily routine here and offer it up as a pleasing sacrifice to God in the most minute things. So
yeah, good. Well, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven.
Give us this day our daily
bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.
Amen.
May the Lord be in your heart and on your lips, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.